Okay, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm Michelle Savage. I'm with XBRL US. We're a nonprofit standards organization, and you're here for our webinar on electric utilities and new FERC XBRL requirements. For today's program, if you have any kind of technical issues, please email us at support@xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back up online. We are offering CPE credit for the program today. So if you're looking for CPE, and if you've signed on for it, or frankly, even if you haven't signed on for it, go ahead and make sure that you respond to the poll questions that we're going to take at 2 different points during the call today. Once we finalize the call and get the poll answers back, we can go ahead and issue those certificates to you for those of you who want to receive it. As we go through the program, if you do have questions, please feel free to click on the Q&A link that you should see at the top of your screen, and you could send questions in to us. Everyone who is an attendee is on mute right now. Only the presenters are live and audible. So with that, I'm going to move on to our next slide and tell you a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. First, we're going to start off by talking about XBRL fundamentals, and I'm going to address part of that, and then I'm going to be turning it over to Campbell Pride. Campbell is our president and CEO. Campbell was also instrumental in developing the FERC taxonomy that you'll be working with starting next year. We'll then cover a couple of CPE questions. We'll go on to instructions on preparing Form 1 and 3Q for electric utilities. We'll take a couple of additional CPE questions, and then we'll cover some other programs and events that might be of interest to you. So first, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on XBRL. XBRL stands for Extensible Business Reporting Language, and it is an open, non-proprietary data standard. It's been around for quite some time, and it's used around the world. It's maintained by XBRL International, which is a global nonprofit standards organization. XBRL International is really responsible for maintaining and expanding upon the specification. And XBRL International has multiple country-specific jurisdictions. And that's frankly what we are. XBRL US is the US jurisdiction. We are the national standard setter. And we're responsible for development work and adoption efforts here in the United States. Just by way of background, as I mentioned, we worked closely with the FERC in the development of the FERC taxonomy, but prior to that, we worked with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We developed taxonomies for public companies, for mutual funds, for credit rating agencies. XBRL is also used by banking institutions, and that was a taxonomy that we were not involved in building, but the FDIC since 2005 has been requiring all banks to report in XBRL as well. So it's a very widely used standard, not just here in the US, but outside the US, frankly, even more extensively for private companies, for public companies, for governments as well. I think it's helpful to point out what XBRL is not. It is not a technical format like XML or JSON or CSV or HTML. In fact, it uses those formats to kind of sit upon for transport. So XBRL really helps to define the characteristics of financial data as well as other types of data like string data and text blocks, and you'll hear more about that. And it relies on an underlying format like XML, JSON, CSV, or even HTML to transport the information to, from point A to point B, essentially. XBRL is also not a product. We do not develop and or sell a product. It's not a product like Excel or some kind of software application. It really is a standard. And frankly, this is part of the benefit of XBRL or adopting standards is that they're not products. They fit into lots of other products. And in fact, there are lots of tool and service providers out there that can use the XBRL taxonomy that FERC created and incorporate it into their software to help you in preparing your filing. XBRL gives meaning to data, and the purpose of this slide is really just to show you how data is represented using a standard like XBRL. This is a form that probably is fairly common to you. It's part of a FERC Form 1, And the value that you're looking at here, 1.2 billion, is something that if it was sent kind of on its own to a machine, it would be incomprehensible. The machine would be unable to see that value or that number and understand what it means. So in order for data to become truly machine readable, we need to embed information into that data point. And that's what XBRL does. For the human eye, we can look at this and we can see based on the rows and the columns exactly what that value represents. But XBRL actually takes that fact, that reported fact, and incorporates information into it so that when a computer receives it, it can see all of the attributes that you see on the right-hand column here. So the items that are colored in gray actually come along with that FERC's taxonomy. So the fact that it's a concept that represents customer accounts receivable, that it has a monetary data type, that it has a certain definition for customer accounts receivable, that comes along with the taxonomy itself. The items that you see in blue come along with the XBRL report or the form that you submit. So the fact that it's represents Pacific Gas and Electric, it's for the period 2019, and the units that are used for the monetary data type are in US dollars. So not in euros, not in some other currency, but in US dollars. So what XBRL does is it embeds all that information into that value so that when it's received, it's immediately understood. So what is a taxonomy? We think of it as a digital dictionary of concepts that represent the data that need to be reported. And what you're seeing here on the left-hand side of the screen is this is a hierarchy that is part of the balance sheet. This is Schedule 110 of the comparative balance sheet for assets and other debits. And so the structure just represents how this data would appear. So with this, I'm actually going to turn it over to Campbell, who's going to take you through how an individual concept is represented in XBRL.
Thanks, Michelle. So this slide is showing a picture of the taxonomy again, and it's looking at an individual concept. In this case, you'll see total assets, which is on the balance sheet. And on the right-hand side, we just have this is from the Yeti viewer, which many of you are familiar with, I'm sure, as many of you put comments on. And so this is giving you on the right-hand side, it gives you the labels that are associated with that element, which are up at the top. And then it's got the references, which indicate there's a form location reference there, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. And then there's the properties of the individual element. So depending where an element appears, and it can appear in multiple schedules, it could have a different label associated with that. So the taxonomy has, and you'll see this if you look at a number of concepts, they'll have different labels associated with it. There's a standard label with just what it's called in the wild if it's not appearing on a schedule, and then there's schedule-specific labels associated with every element as well. So that's there, and that's the taxonomy. You can look those up. Jumping to the bottom, there's properties, and that's really just tells you what type of name, the name of the element, what data type it is. In this case, you can see it's a monetary item type, what period it is. This tells you if it's a flow or a stock. In this case, or an instant or a duration means the same thing. So obviously, total assets is measured at an instant in time, and that's what that means. And abstract really means if it can take a value or not. So abstract true means it doesn't take a value. Abstract false means it does. And then it also gives you the balance. And if the amount is nillable, that means, can you report it with no value? So the other thing that's important here, you can see on the references, and every element has a reference associated with it. That was a value in the, typically is a value that needs to be reported, and these references really define the map from the original forms that you're familiar with. So you can see here for this item, you can see with the value some of these form locations. If you look at the second one, that's basically saying column C, row 80. This item appears on column C, row 85, and it's the current value of it. And then you'll see the next one's got D, and it's got the period of prior. So what this means is just a map. And so you can use this map to basically be able to link between what was on the form and what was on the and what's in the XBRL taxonomy. Now, just a warning with this. These references are all from the perspective of the Visual Fox Pro program. So in some cases, the reference won't look correct, and that's because it's referencing where that data was coming from the Visual Fox Pro database, which was used to capture all this data historically. And what these references are being used for primarily at the moment is to basically take the data from the Visual Fox Pro database and then create instances of these documents. And some of you have seen these are on the FERC website. They've gone through and they've created, for all your filings and historical filings, they're basically creating an XBRL version of them based on what's the Visual Fox Pro database. We've gone through that as well, and we've created and added some additions to the taxonomy just to basically capture where these items were on the form. So if you go to the next slide, Michelle. And we'll be making these available on our website as well. And so this basically links between, so it kind of changes the order of it. And I'll show you this once we've gone through the slides, just what it looks like comprehensively. So then this way you can look up a schedule, you can look up a row, you can look up the column number, and then you can see what was the element, what was the period, and what should the dimensions be if I'm going to tag it. So it's a really useful reference material if you just want to, if you basically want to be able to map between what was the form and what is its equivalent in XBRL. So there's information in the taxonomy to help you on that, but for some schedules for the balance sheet, they're exactly the same because the VFP and the Visual Fox Pro database and the actual schedule are identical, but there's a number of schedules where there's differences between them. So I just want to make sure everyone's aware of that, and that the references link back to basically the physical location in the VFP program. So you want to go to the next slide, Michelle? One of the things we talked about there on every element, it has properties. There's a number of different elements, different data types that are used in the taxonomy. Obviously, monetary, as Michelle mentioned, every monetary amount has to be represented in US dollars. Some items are in integers, some items are in percents, there's strings, there's text blocks. And depending on the schedule, there are a number of specific data types which are associated with different units of measure. So you'll see those in the taxonomy. We'll talk about those a little bit in a minute. But generally, if you've got a data type like the area, then that's going to be, measured in whatever the standard area of measure is. That'll be the same for the specific form. And things like energy, and then that would be that would be usually in a standard, like a standard measure, megawatt hours or something like that. Okay, so in addition, and you've seen this in the ED tool, it contains some relationships between the elements. There's a presentation which just basically helps to define the order in which things will appear. The presentation is kind of important, so that'll basically dictate that, for a number of schedules, the order in which things are, like for example, the balance sheet and the cash flow, where all the items are, and make sure they appear in the right place. There are some calculations defined in the taxonomy as well. If you're familiar with SEC reporting, there's not quite as many calculations in here. Sometimes the calculations can't really be defined. So a lot of the calculations defined in the business rules, the validation rules, which we'll talk about as well. So if you don't see a calculation, but when you run the validation rules, you'll see some of those checks being done. There's a definition link base in there as well. And this just really controls, and this is being used for the FERC filers to really identify if you've reported values that are invalid. So sometimes when you validate, you may see errors you get that say, this fact's invalid. And that means you've probably put the wrong dimension on a fact. So it basically just helps to constrain the data that you can create so you don't create information that's incorrect. The references we kind of talked about, and the labels we talked about as well. So we'll go to the next slide, Michelle. And this is really just to highlight the difference between a taxonomy and an instance document. The taxonomy really, it just defines all the meta model, really. It just defines all the concepts that you're going to use. It's really the same as a blank form. And the XBRL instance is really just the form with the data filled out. So we can, and the FERC's put up on their website some blank forms. Those blank forms have just been purely just generated based on the taxonomy. And then the examples with data in it, it basically takes the taxonomy in the instance document and it creates the populated form. So that's just really the difference. The instance really contains just the numbers and what's the unit of measure on them, and what period is applicable to them. Next slide, Michelle. I think we've got some CPE questions.
Yeah, I think we're going to cover a couple of CPE questions here. So I'm going to start the first poll, and hopefully you should all be able to see this now. So the first question, an XBRL instance document or an XBRL report can be best characterized by which the following statements: represents the facts reported in a financial statement, for example, PG&E's 2019 Form 1, or number 2, represents a digital dictionary of concepts that need to be reported, or 3, represents the hierarchical structure and relationship between items needed to be reported in a financial statement. Which of those 3 statements best represents an XBRL instance document? And we'll give you about another 20 seconds here, and then we'll go on to our next CP question. Okay, just another 5 seconds. And remember, even if you did not sign up for CPE, you can still get it if you go ahead and respond to the poll, and then we can deal with the paperwork later on. Okay, so I'm going to end the polling here. And we'll go to poll number 2. Which statement best represents the definition of the XBRL standard? Is it 1, it is a technical format like XML, JSON, or CSV? Is it number 2, it is an open, non-proprietary standard that renders financial and other types of data into machine-readable format? Or is it number 3, it is a product like Excel or a software application that makes data computer readable? So we'll just take another 30 seconds or so here. Okay, just another 15 seconds, and then we'll be closing down the polls. And we'll be taking polls again, another two additional questions at the end. Okay, I'm going to close down the poll here. All right, great. Okay, thanks everybody. I'm going to turn it back over to Campbell now, who's going to start going through instructions.
All right, thanks, Michelle. So I'm just going to go through what we've just pulled together here is some of the tagging issues, and these are some of the issues that we had encountered when we went through and created a whole bunch of sample forms. And I thought these are the issues we ran into, and I think they're kind of relevant for if you're selecting a software vendor, but also relevant when you start to collect this data, and just issues to be aware of, and thought it'd be useful to bring those to your attention, just so you know what's going on. And these slides will be available so you can refer back to them as well. And then also some of the materials that we've developed to help you to deal with that. So if we go to the next slide, so we're going to deal with just some of the tagging issues. And you can see the list there, and we'll go through each of these now. So you go to the next slide, Michelle. So type dimensions. So what this is, and as many of you are aware, in the FERC forms, there's a lot of disclosure, which is just lists of items that need to be reported. And there's quite a bit of flexibility. The form's not that rigid. They give you a lot of flexibility in how you can report stuff. So one of the things, the decisions that was made, and this is based on the experience the SEC had, was to try and avoid using extensions. So we wanted to make this as simple as possible for the filers. So all you'd have to file would just be the instance document. You don't have to file any of the taxonomy stuff. So for those familiar with SEC reporting, you've got to report a whole bunch of other files. What's the presentation? What's our calculations? And all this stuff. So to try and avoid all that, the idea was you just need to be able to provide a single instance document to the FERC. However, to capture a lot of information, that means using type dimensions. Now, these are not so widely used in SEC reporting. There are some, but not all filing agents had support for it probably up to a year ago, but I think most of them do now. So if you're looking at filing agents, you want to ask this question. You want to ask them, do you support type dimensions? You need to be able to support them to do FERC filing. So that's something you should just be aware of. And we've just used the term sequences here. It's just really sequences, like 1, 2, it's repeating items that you may have to report. So examples of that might be, the list of directors, or the list of all the transmission lines, or the list of substations that you have. So you can go through and then you can list all these items out. The other place they appear is in particular in financial statement items that aren't fixed, and you see examples of this like with the cash flow statement where you've got blank lines and you can add your own stuff in. Retained earnings where you can show the movements and the credits or the debits. And there's a number of schedules with varying degrees of complexity that allow you to do this type of thing. So this is where these type dimensions are used. So you need that. One of the things that this does change a little bit is that, the lines that you had before were limited, but with the type, like in the cash flow statement, you had like 3 lines or 4 lines in some cases. So with these type dimensions, you can add as many lines as you want. There's no real restriction on that. And so in the past, you may have had to overflow those into footnotes. You won't need to do that anymore. So each of these dimensions, you have to put a member on each of them, and that's defined in the instance. You can basically just define what they are. If you look at some of the examples that have been created, we've just basically used the row numbers as the member numbers. However, that's kind of not ideal. When the VFP data was converted, there was kind of some, this information loss from filing to filing in general. But if you've got a member for a director, you kind of want to use, you want to use the same, member for the same director from period to period. So the format or the name that you use for the type dimensions can be anything you want. So it's what's called a token type. So it can be string, number, whatever. But if John Smith is a director of the company, in year 1 you're doing the filing again, you should use the same member. So you may want to think about how are we going to call these members so we can link them up from period to period. So for different schedules, you might want to say, okay, we're just going to use the first and last name for the directors, or for the executives of the company. So that's just something to consider, and that's something that's up to the filers to make sure that they do from period to period. Every fact that's in one of these schedules needs to have this sequence dimension on it. So what that means is, so like if you've got a row of data, so it's a director, or let's say it's an executive, and what's their salary and when they started or when they ended, or whatever information associated with that, they're all going to have the same member on it. So what that happens is when that data is submitted to the FERC and they render the form, or you render the form, then all those items will appear on the same row. The other thing that is a bit different from the previous forms was sometimes you would put information, you'd spread it over multiple rows because there just wasn't space in the row to do it. With this has changed a little bit in that sense that all that data will now appear in the single row. You can put spaces between the rows if you really wanted to, but you shouldn't be having content split over multiple members when it represents the same thing. So that's just something to be aware of. The other thing is they sequence a number of sequence tables will have a total at the bottom. So basically what's going to happen in those cases is the general rule, it's going to be the same element, it's going to be used for the total. It's just not going to have the sequence axes or the type dimension axes on it. So that's type dimensions. Okay. So sorting, this is all of these items that are in a sequence dimension are going to be, the order that they appear in. You need to determine the order that they will show when you render the form. So generally, you could just put the data in, and that order of that could be, based probably on the first field, like the first column that's in the schedule. But you probably want to control the order that these schedules appear in. So this idea of an order number, so you can put an order number on every row so that you can control the order. The order number itself doesn't appear on the schedule, but it's in the XBRL instance, and it's a decimal. And the reason it's a decimal is so that you can just keep the order number the same from period to period, but you may want to insert new order items between items. So you could do 1.02 or 1.03 or 1.21 if you want to insert something later on, just to make it a little bit easier. The order number then would also just have the same dimension and dimension member as all the other facts for the row, just so they all line up. In the filings that you've seen that the FERC generated for the historical data, there are order numbers put on that to make the order the same, and they just basically, the order numbers are basically the row numbers from the schedule. So that's where those order numbers came from. So, you know, maybe you want to pick up those and use the same thing. That would be fine too. The order data itself doesn't really mean anything. It's just so that you can make your filing look how you want it to look. On these order numbers, some schedules have subtotals on them, like there's a form for taxes accrued 262, and they can have subtotals on it. In some cases, the orders that, you know, you want to have a single sequence for the order number, but sometimes order numbers may jump across 2 dimensions, and that may happen in some cases for these specific schedules. And I'll show you how that kind of works a little bit later on, and then so you can see how it works. But the important thing from the sorting perspective is just really making sure, and for most XBRL software support, you should expect, you know, if they've got type dimensions, they should be able to support sorting as well. Most of the work that really happens here is when the rendering occurs, and this is just really something about making the filing look how you want it to look, which obviously makes review easier. Okay, if we go to the next. The other thing worth mentioning is duplicate values. Obviously, in the past, when this data was going into the Visual FoxPro database, a lot of the data that would appear in one schedule wouldn't necessarily populate the data in the other schedule. You had to enter the data twice. That's not the case anymore. You only have to enter the data in one location, and then it will populate in all places. So for example, like common stock issued, it appears on schedule 114 and 250. If you put it on 114, it will appear at the bottom of 250 as the total. In some cases, generally you shouldn't have a difference between these. Some cases you may. So what you would need to do, what the FERC's asking people to do, is just put a footnote on that value and say, look, you know, on the schedule, the subtotal is actually different because we have this different item. In those cases where we noticed historically where there are a lot of differences between items, we would expect them to add, but they didn't. There were some reasons for it. In some cases, the forms didn't have an extra line item that they should have. We actually created different line items were created for the same, which would effectively be the same disclosure. So in some cases, you may note that, oh, I put a value and I would expect the value to appear in the income statement, but it doesn't. In those cases, there's different elements. The reason that happens is because we noticed in a significant number of cases, companies would have different values for those items. And normally the reason for that was on the schedule, you know, the schedule wasn't capturing some adjustment. And so there were these differences, and then people would explain the adjustment in a footnote. So that's still the same. And in those cases, we've generally tried to make those, use different elements where we know those cases occur. Okay, so we go to the next slide, Michelle. Just generally on accuracy in units, all monetary amounts are in US dollars. There is a label in the taxonomy. If you look at the taxonomy, every element that is it's going to be a unit that's different than US dollars is going to have a label on it that says, you know, this is the unit to use. There are validation rules that will also check that those elements are using those units. So if you put the wrong unit on, then, you know, for example, if you put, you know, what's the total production of our power plant and you put it in kilowatt hours, then it would say, no, you've got to use megawatt hours for this element. So that's in there. So you probably can't go too far wrong with that. The other thing is just on accuracy. The FERC requires that numbers are accurate to the dollar, as I'm sure you're all aware. So just the one thing, when you're creating the XBRL instance, there's an attribute which can say, you know, what the decimals are. So pretty much in general, you're always going to set that to 0. So there's not really a decision to make there. If you want to go to the next slide, Michelle. The other information you're going to have to enter into the instance documents is the periods. All facts have a period. So that's basically, they can be either a duration or an instant measured over time or at a point in time. And those periods are determined based on the on the report year and the report period. So the way the form is rendered, it looks at the report year and the report period. You've got to populate those two values in your XBRL instance, and once you populate them, that'll determine where all the numbers go. So if you put 2017 as the report year, and then you put a fact for 2016, that'll be in the prior column wherever you got historical data. You flip it to 2018, all those numbers for 2016 will disappear. And in fact, you'll get a bunch of validation errors saying, hey, you've reported data for a 2018 report that you shouldn't be reporting. So that's good to know. But from selecting software, this is also useful because you shouldn't have to re-enter all the values for the prior year. So if you flip the software, if you flip the year over for the next year, all the values that are for the current year should flip to the prior year. And then you might want to ask your software vendors, do you have a tool to just basically pull out, can you roll over from one year to the next? Do you have a function to do that? Because you certainly don't want to be entering all the historical data. Just to be aware, across a number of different schedules, there's different periods that can be used. Obviously, if you're reporting most of them are going to be for the current period, which if you're doing an annual filing, it's just going to be for the whole year, or a quarterly, it's going to be, the start to what that period is. Most amounts, as you're aware, are reported cumulatively. However, there are some schedules, there are some gotchas in there you just be careful of. And we even noticed looking at the historical data, sometimes people weren't aware that data was for the specific quarter versus for the cumulative quarter. So we've tried to make that a lot clearer now. And we put rules in that'll detect that. So if you've got the periods incorrect, it should tell you that you've got the wrong period. So when you get these validation rules telling you the period's incorrect, then you may want to go back and look at the schedule and just make sure you've got it correct. And then there's the sample data. You can go and look at the sample data as well and see how these things are expected to be tagged. In the map we've created, we've also indicated what are the periods you should be able to use. In some cases, for things like quarterly reports for the cash flow, then obviously like that, those, the closing balance and one balance for the quarterly cash flow is not going to be equal to the opening balance. So there's a number of things, which has always been the case, but this is one of the things that you just got to be careful about. And then some of these schedules are just for the quarter, and some of them are cumulative for the quarter. So just to be aware of those. There are some roll forward schedules that roll forward from the previous quarter rather than the start of the year as well. And for the AOCI schedule, for example, if you're doing that quarterly, just to be aware that the periods need to be lined up correctly. And we'll show you how to do that easily just with some of these mappings that we've provided. You go to the next slide, please, Michelle. Text block items, just to make you aware of this, if you're an SEC filer as well, and you're reporting, and you take your financial footnotes, for example, and then you copy them into your FERC filing, you can still do that. One of the things just to be aware of, you don't want to put the inline XBRL into that document. Because then when the FERC takes this document and tries to render it in inline XBRL, you've kind of got a Russian doll situation. So one of the things you need to do is you could just take the text block that the SEC renders in their SEC renderer. They basically strip all the inline XBRL out. You can just basically copy that and drop it into the FERC filing, and it should come up properly. So you shouldn't have to spend too much time updating that. And if you are having issues with that, you should just talk to your software vendor and make sure they handle it. And we're more than happy to show you how you just do that manually for the filing as well. So that's just something to be aware of with the text block item. So the styling, you can style those text blocks if you want to make them pretty format or make them colors or do that kind of stuff. You can do that. So that's still all available. One of the things is there is styling associated with a form. When the form is generated, is rendered, it has a styling that's which basically styles it in the format of the form. We generally try to do that in a way that it won't conflict with any styling that you would have in your footnote. You should probably just double check it to make sure that there isn't, that the formatting is coming out the way that you would expect it to. If you go to the next slide, please, Michelle. Just on subtotals, a number of schedules have subtotals in them. And so the way that the validation rules work, they'll go down the schedule and they'll add things up and they'll make sure the totals add. But if you put subtotals in, then they won't add unless you do specific things. So just to be aware of this, on some of these subtotals, you've got to make sure that you can tag those with the different axes. So when you're looking at the software you want to use and they're just saying, oh, it's very generic, be aware that some of these schedules aren't generic. You just can't have like a whole list of sequence items. Sometimes some of these subtotals are going to have to be reported with the different axes. And examples of this are on schedule 250, for example. And these slides will be available so you can go and have a look at those. If we go to the next slide. Just in terms, so validations, the FERC is providing validation rules. Just so you're aware of, there's two different ways you can run those validations. You would expect your software to incorporate those validations, so you really want to be able to run them, obviously, before you submit them to FERC. If you submit them to FERC, they will also run the validations, so you'll get the results back. We're putting the validations up on our website as well, so if you want to run them against our website, you can run those validations there too. And there's open source software that you can download, and you can install that as well and run the validations yourself if you want to. The validations, the separate validations for each form type. So one set of validations will run on the form 1, it'll run on the form 1, the form 1F, and the form and the quarterly forms. And then there's a separate set of validations for like the 714, for example. The validations generally will do checks, just the cross checks, the opening to, the roll forward type checks, and basically all the validations that you see in the forms today, plus additional ones for, the cross and down, and basically just doing all the cross footing. And basically rules have been added for all of those. They also, where there are cross checks across forms, it'll validate those. It'll take the sequences, it'll add those totals. We expect them to be the same. It will also check the periods are correct, which you've already mentioned earlier, that you haven't reported periods that don't exist in the filing. We'll check the units are correct, that you've got all the required elements that you should be reporting. And generally, some of the instructions we're going to make available will include the validation and just descriptions of what those validations in there as well. And as I mentioned earlier, you can download open source XBRL software called XBRL that can also do these validations. Can I go to the next slide, please, Michelle? Okay, let's talk about rendering. So when you create these things, and hopefully this will be hidden for you, the software vendors will probably hide this, but if they don't, then we can, and you need to take an XBRL instance and you want to render it yourself, you can do that as well. You can render one of the things you can do with the rendering software that's been made available is you can either render the entire form, if you want to do that in one go. The FERC, when you file it, will render the entire form and then basically send you an email when it's finished rendering. Some of these forms, depending, like the form 1 if it's like the annual filing and you've got a big filing, like if you're Alabama Power or something like that, it could, that rendering could take upwards of 8 minutes to render. So just to be aware of that, you need to get a coffee. But then to make this easier, we've also putting something up on our website, which I'll show you in a minute, which allows you just to render a specific schedule so you can check it. If you have an instance document, you can say, look, render the schedule, and it only takes like 20 seconds or so, and then you can see what the rendered schedule will look like. The rendering creates a valid inline XBRL document, so all those documents are valid inline XBRL, so they can be used by XBRL inline validation tools. You can, we've opened them up in the SEC renderer, so you can look at them in there. And I'll show you, we've got an example of this on our website in a minute. And finally, Michelle, on the next slide. Just footnotes, just a note on this. So basically, footnotes are supported. You need to be able to link a fact to the footnote. If you're looking at software for this, you need to be able to the ability to find a relationship between the fact and the footnote. So you need to be able to do that. And this works exactly the same way as what it did in the VisualFox Pro. And basically, I've got a link. I can link it to this fact to another another block of text. So the software should, as I mentioned, create footnotes, but it should be able to create two types of footnotes. The first one is a fact footnote. Basically, this is my fact, and then you can have a footnote with, hundreds of lines of text or whatever if you want to associate it with that footnote. The second thing it should be able to support is basically a fact-to-fact footnote, and this links one fact to another fact. And this is this is needed if you ever wanted to request confidential data. So this was always available in the Visual Fox Pro, but I don't think anyone ever did it. I don't think FERC's ever approved one, but that's supported as well. So that means you can, basically what that means is you can link the fact to itself and it'll just basically say this is confidential. It allows you to indicate that that particular fact is confidential. When the FERC basically process it, they'll strip that fact out of the filing. All right. So I think I was going to share my screen now just to do that. Hold on, let me just.
Yeah, Campbell, I think you're going to do some demonstrations, and
yeah,
then
just let me share my screen.
Back over to me. So I'm going to stop sharing right now.
Okay, thank you.
And as we do this, as you're in the process of switching over, we did get a question from the group, and we will be covering after the demo, we're going to be covering a little bit more about vendors, things to ask, and vendors that do provide tools and offerings to help. And the question that came in, so I'm going to pose to you, Campbell, is my group will only use XBRL once a year to submit Form 714. Would it make more sense to 1, pay a contractor to handle it, 2, purchase a tool and hire a contractor to train us, or 3, purchase the tool and train ourselves?
So on the 714, that's a pretty simple form. So when we do, we're going to do an event on this and present some of the options for 714. Most of this data is being presented as Excel. You know, there's you have to look at what software people are going to support for this and how much they're going to charge. But, you know, generally you should be able to, you know, I wouldn't be surprised for that particular schedule if people just don't make an XBRL instance, that you can basically define it in Excel and then just convert the Excel into an instance. And if that software is available, then it's probably easier for you just to use that software to do that. That's a very data-centric form. It's not very complicated. So it would depend on what the software there are, but I think the third option is probably very, very easy to do, just because it's just the nature is you're going to have to put all that data in. You're going to have to get it in. You probably have it in a spreadsheet anyway. So that may be what makes the most sense. And I know I created some of the 714 forms just out of a spreadsheet anyway. So that's probably the easier thing to do on that particular schedule. And for the Form 1, that's obviously a different situation altogether, just because to create the whole entire Form 1 and maintain it in Excel, maybe not something people want to do. I'm sure people do it. And I know some of the software vendors that we've been talking to are having a combination of different approaches to this. So in some cases, I think probably wait and see what's available. But I definitely think the third option that you've listed there is possible as well. Okay, so I think my screen sharing. The first thing I was just going to show you, we've just put up on our website, and this is just for resources. If you can go to the XBRL US website, we just have something called FERC reporting, and we're just going to start putting stuff up here. This isn't finished yet, but we're going to make the we just have tools and instructions, and this is really just stuff to help you basically do your filing. So you can do validation, and then you can do things like do rendering. So if you want to choose a filing, for example, I think I have one here. Just find one. So I thought I had one here. I lost it. So I've got a sample form. I'll just use this. This is just the sample form, but then this is a Form 1, and then I can choose what particular form I want for it. And so let's say I wanted to look at, something like the directives for that. Then I can submit that, and then I'll just render that particular schedule. Or I could do, any schedule I wanted. You got a couple of choices. You can say only include financial statement facts, which you want to do if you've got this. Because this creates an inline document, what it would do, if you don't click that, it would create all the data in the filing, but it would just have them all as hidden facts in the filing, in the HTML, which you probably don't want to do, just if you wanted to see if your filings look okay. And then we also have, you can put the style formatting in the CSS in a separate file. If you wanted to reformat it yourself, you may want to do that, because you might want to say, oh, I want to highlight numbers in a different color, or whatever you might want to be able to do. And so I kind of rendered some of these This sample form was kind of not the best one to choose because it's like it's a massive filing. It basically represents every single fact that's there. So then you can see it's come back. Here's this. So this has just done the director's schedule, and you can see just an example of what, and it's rendered this back. You shouldn't, generally, you don't want to do this anymore. This is just using migrated data. You want to try and push all this data into the single cell because obviously, you know, these rows now represent separate directors. So obviously, this is what I was talking about earlier. This data here should be sitting in that one cell. They've just separate these out with separate dimensions on it. But then at least you can see how this data looks and how it renders on a schedule by schedule basis, and it makes it a little bit faster. And you can say, okay, I've prepared all this data. Let me see what it looks like. So that's an option that's available there as well. Your software that you're looking at should probably incorporate this and be able to do this anyway. We just made this available so people can see and they can start using this stuff if they wanted to use it. The other thing we've made available is we have these maps. I'll just show you what these look like. So this is kind of this was to help us because as people started to ask us questions, but I think it's useful for everyone as well. And so this just basically looks at every schedule. And then if I look at the schedule, it's basically just row 2, column C, tag that with operating revenues and the current tag and the prior. You got things like directors. You can click on these and you can see, this is just showing, okay, this is the element that you should use. This is the period. This is the axes that you should use on it, tariffs. And it basically, this has everything in there. So if this can be useful too if you've got the balance sheet. You can look for where something appears, if it appears across multiple schedules. So you can see it's also that same element is appearing in the schedule here, which is going to be the nuclear materials schedule. So you can see where it is, and this is the current value. It's telling you what's the periods that you should be putting on this. And this basically covers everything. Some of these, like the allowances schedules, a little bit more complicated. Some of you may be familiar with this, schedule 228. Whether it's sulfur dioxide or nitrogen, that's going to have a different dimension on it. If it's the current year, it's the 3 years. So it just tells you for row 18, column K, use this element, put it in the current period, put these dimensions on it, and then it'll appear in the right place. So the schedule is kind of useful, and this basically lists off for the entire Form 1, and we're doing these for the Form 1, the Form 2, and the Form 714, all these forms. So there's quite a lot of information here, and some of the stuff is obvious, but sometimes it's not so obvious. So this can be kind of useful just to help out with that. So I think I covered the validation. We're also publishing instructions out as well for each form, just to go through, kind of address some of the gotchas. So in the statement of cash flows, for example, when items are negative, sometimes, the increase, decrease, should it be negative? Should it be positive? This kind of just tells you how to deal with those, what you do with the periods, the units, the dimensions. There are some things with these sequence groups where you can have the non-cash adjustments, and this is where you have multiple line items, and it just basically tells you how to deal with each of those. There's like 7 different sequence groups in the cash flows where they've got blank lines where you can add stuff, and this kind of just goes through that. We also include in here just elements in the schedule, other schedules like net income loss also appears in 114, the statement of income, 122A, and 261. So it kind of just gives you an index of those so you can see which schedules things appear in. So if you enter the value here in the balance sheet, in the income statement for this, it's automatically going to appear in some of these other schedules as well. So that's there as well, and that's going to be available. That's available on the website as well. So I think that's all I wanted to cover. I'm going to stop sharing. And then,
okay,
but if you want to,
yeah. I'm sorry, we are getting a couple of questions here.
Yeah.
Okay, the first question is, can you elaborate on the values that are the same? For example, on the balance sheet, an example would be page 110 to 111, lines 30 and 64, long-term portion of derivative assets, 175 will have the same value. That's
right. So if you enter the value in for that in the balance sheet, then it's going to appear in the other part of the balance sheet as well. So you only have to enter the value in there once. If they're different, one would hope they're not, but if they are, then you need to put a footnote on. I don't think we saw any differences on that particular item.
Okay, and then we also got a question, can the link be shared with the group? And the answer to that is yes, because we have this platform that we're going to be talking about a little bit that Campbell's been showing, and that we'll be sending this out to everybody who registered for the event today.
Any other questions?
I think that's it for questions for now. Should we, I will go ahead and start sharing myself.
Yep.
Okay, the next thing that we wanted to address is working with vendors. And I know obviously everyone is trying to figure out how they're going to begin complying next year. We just want to give you a list of XBRL US members that we know are, if they're not ready to go right now, that they will soon have, FERC compliance capabilities that you can access. And we'll send this list out, the slides as well as the replay for the event will be sent out to everyone later on. And if you're looking for contact information, just let me know. But the companies that are members of XBRL US and that we know have experience in XBRL preparation are Advanced Computer Innovations, DataTrax, Donnelly Financial Solutions, Iris Business Services, NovaWorks, P3 Data Systems, RDG Filings, and Workiva. And chances are your SEC filing folks are probably working with one of these vendors already. And you might want to check with them to see which ones they use, or contact all of them, check them all out. And we also put together a list of questions that you may want to consider asking each of the vendors that you're looking into. And some of these are questions that Campbell raised during his portion. Does your application support FERC validation? FERC has, established a whole set of business rules, and you want to make sure that you're able to run those rules in the tool that is preparing your filing. Does it support type dimensions? As Campbell explained, this is pretty critical, and you need to be able to handle type dimensions with your filing. What experience do you have preparing XBRL for other entities? Obviously you want to go with a known quantity that has done this for SEC reporting or for other types of reporting. How long will it take to prepare the XBRL filing? Obviously you will have deadlines that you need to meet, and you want to make sure that all timing is taken into account. How can I review the XBRL tags used on each fact? You want to make sure that you're able to do this. This is your filing. Your vendor is going to do the best they possibly can, but you can't just outsource everything, and you want to be able to make sure that you're able to review the tags. If you have multiple parties internally that need to review it, like let's say it needs to go to compliance and legal and other departments within the company, you want to make sure that there's the ability to kind of pass that along and check out and give approvals. And I know some of the tools do have those capabilities. If you need to change a value in a report, like at the last minute, how long is it going to take the vendor to make that change? Are you going to be able to make those deadlines? How will the process differ the second time you do it? What we found with SEC reporting is that, and SEC reporting is quite different, as Campbell explained, but the first time around was very challenging and required putting a template together and identifying the tags and creating custom extensions. And then the second time around was much easier. It's not going to be quite as complex for FERC filing because you don't have to deal with extensions, which is which is a good thing. But it will probably be easier the second and third and fourth time around. And you can get a sense for that by talking to your vendor about it. Also, can the vendor give you a printout of the FERC rendering of your filing? That can be really, really helpful in terms of doing that review so that you can look at it and identify the tags and make sure that the values are being put in the right buckets for the form.
And just on this, just so you're aware, there are different choices here. There maybe some of these guys will just say, oh, here's the software, you can go ahead and you can do it yourself and do that. And then and I'm sure there's going to be other vendors who will say, we'll do the whole thing for you. So obviously, there's obviously different choices that you can make. And just from a design perspective, one of the things we've tried to do is make this as generic and as vanilla XBRL as possible. So there shouldn't really be too many problems from a technology standpoint, and also to be able to support, one of the things you probably should be looking at is how can we just get all this data straight out of our systems directly, and then just have it feeding into a single document and then going up to the FERC. So that's possible as well, particularly for some of these things which are very data centric, like as mentioned earlier, like the Form 714. But in the Form 1 as well, a lot of this data, a lot of it's pretty. If you can get that data from source systems, it may be possible just to completely automate that in without actually having to do any manual entry as well. So that's obviously these filings better than we do, but how you collect that data internally, that may be something, how those software vendors can integrate that and pull that data in automatically. So hopefully out of this, people shouldn't have to be manually entering this data or typing this data again.
Kim, we did get a question, and I think the next thing we're going to go on to is CPE credit. And the question we got is, how are XBRL files typically modified or updated? You can answer that as I'm switching over here.
Yeah, this it depends. There's multiple ways. If you're looking at it through software, obviously you can just key it into software. Maybe it's just automatically populated. You can just reload those filings from a source data system, or even have code update them as well. We've done, people do all of those things. So there's different choices. It totally depends. At the end of the day, the data itself can be prepared in a spreadsheet and output as XBRL, or it could be just done through software, or some people just go into the XML directly and then just change the XML as well if they wanted to. So it's kind of wide open. There's no real, one way to do it. So there's multiple ways of doing this. And one of the things that we do it is I put it all into like spreadsheets or whatever, and then just generate the data out of a spreadsheet. But it really depends on the complexity and the size of the data. But if you're looking at, if you had said, oh, I'm just going to prepare these manually myself, maybe you want to do it in a spreadsheet, and then you just create them in a spreadsheet, and then you can save those as XBRL using a tool like RL. There's lots of different choices, and I think it really depends. There's some choices would depend on the size of your filing. I know a lot of filers, there's not that much data they have actually in the Form 1, so some of it for them it just makes sense. I'm just going to bash this into a tool that someone has. Whereas some of these large filings, if you're a massive utility, then obviously you want to be able to automating all that data being loaded. So it really depends.
Okay, thanks. Those are the questions that we have so far. We're going to go on to our final two CPE questions, and then we have a little bit of follow-up of other programs and also webcasts that are offered by XBRL US that might be of interest to you also. So stick around for that. But first, let me go ahead and launch polls. Our third poll is, which statement below best describes the FERC taxonomy? Is it number one, an open taxonomy, which means that FERC filers can create new custom reported items that are not in the current FERC taxonomy? Is it a closed taxonomy, which means that FERC filers are limited to using only the concepts provided in the FERC taxonomy? Or is it a hybrid taxonomy, which means that the FERC allows some custom items, but not others? Which of those responses best describes the FERC taxonomy that everyone's going to begin working with next year? Okay, so just like another 15 seconds here. We'll move to the last one. Okay, we're going to close out the polling for this question and move on to the last poll. Okay, which of the items below are not found in a taxonomy? A hierarchy of concepts, data types, for example, monetary, string, or text block, or units, for example, currency or measures of volume or energy. Which of these items are not found in a taxonomy? Okay, so just another 30 seconds here. Okay, I'm going to be closing the poll now. And thanks everybody for giving your responses. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I wanted to just walk you through what Campbell was showing today in terms of this platform that we've created for FERC reporting. And if you go to our homepage, you can actually get it by clicking on the link called Filers. And then it'll give you an option of SEC reporting, FDIC reporting, and FERC reporting. And so clicking on FERC reporting or just going to the URL that you see at the top of the screen here, you'll be given 4 different choices. Tools and instructions, a lot of what Campbell was walking you through today, where you'll be able to get those step-by-step instructions as well as mapping guides that walk you through exactly how to create each individual schedule. There's also a rendering tool that Campbell demonstrated that'll let you render a FERC filing, your own filing, or there are actually some samples up there that you can take a look at to see how it's going to appear. You'll also have access to the FERC taxonomy there, of course. And coming soon, we don't have it up there right now, but we'll be able to give you access to a tool that lets you check your filing for data quality rules, for those FERC data quality validation rules. So with the tools and instruction, many of these, we will provide samples and examples, and we'll give you, some level of access. And then, to get the entire, to have access to everything, you'll need to become a member of XBRL US, and we'll give you information on that as well. The second bucket that you see here is run applications locally. There may be some filers that would prefer to run the applications on their local systems rather than uploading data for various filings to a remote system. And so we provide you with code and instructions on how to do that here. The data bucket will give you access to peer historical data. This again is coming soon, but we'll have this up pretty quickly and give you access to your peer data so that you can see what other companies are doing. And then education gives you access to a lot of the webinars that we're holding, various FAQs, and other types of instructional content that we think will be helpful for FERC filers. And I want to mention some of the other webinars that we have coming up. We have a gas pipeline coming up on tomorrow, actually November 4th. Oil pipeline companies, December 1st, centralized service companies, December 2nd, electric transmitting utilities on December 10th. And then you're all invited to come to our investor forum, which is November 17th through 18th, where we're going to have keynote speakers from the SEC, SEC Commissioner Allison Heron-Lee, and also PwC Vice Chair Wes Bricker will be providing keynote addresses at that session. These are all free events, and we hope that we'll see you at some of these going forward. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Campbell, for taking us through everything. And we'll be sending out some materials to all of you in the next day or two to give you backup information, also the replay for this event. Thanks very much, and good luck on working on your filings.